what we need in this moment is an ethos of repair, that we need to repair our relationships with the planet. We need to repair the damage that we've done. We need to clean up these areas of huge devastation. And we need to repair our relationships with each other, including making reparation for harms that in many cases date back hundreds of years.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Inquiry. In a few weeks from now, 190 countries will be gathering at Glasgow to discuss climate change and the ways in which nations and economies can transform themselves to avert a climate catastrophe. We've already experienced being engulfed in fires and storms, floods and droughts, and 1 million species are dying around us. And still, we seem to be encased in a kind of fantasy of safety. So to pierce through that and to discuss what's at stake, I have one of the world's most eloquent, passionate, and influential writers and activists on the show today. Naomi Klein has been arguing for a completely different imagination of the world for many years through books like The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, On Fire, and many others which have been translated into more than 30 languages. Her latest book, How to Change Everything, focuses on the global youth movement for climate justice, and it speaks of why there may be some ground for hope. I spoke to Naomi in Canada a few days ago, where she is the professor of climate justice at the University of British Columbia. Do listen in. Thank you so much for joining me on Inquiry, Naomi. I've really been waiting to do this with you, so it's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
I'm delighted to be with you.
So Naomi, I want to start with the newsy end of our conversation, which is that the COP26 at Glasgow is coming up at the end of this month, and there's a lot riding on it. So what's your dominant emotion in the run up to it? Is it hope? Is it despair? Are you expecting a lot? Where do you stand?
I am not expecting a lot. I'm sorry. I do think that it's good that we don't have Donald Trump just sort of sweeping all the dishes off the table. But the people we have around this table have a pretty long track record of saying all the right things about climate change and doubling down on fossil fuels. And unfortunately, that's the case for Biden. I think it's the case for Modi. It's really the case for all of them. So there's still a few outright.
Trudeau.
Sorry,
I said all for Trudeau.
Absolutely, Trudeau. Justin Trudeau went to the Paris Climate Accords as a newly elected prime minister. There was lots of hope because we had had 9 years of a conservative government in Canada that had pulled out of climate negotiations. Justin Trudeau went to Paris, put his hand on his heart and said, Canada is back, and stood with Pacific Island nations and made sure there was the 1.5 degree temperature target rather than just the 2 degree temperature target, which is the end of so many low-lying islands. Canada stood there and said, we understand that this is an existential threat, and got so much good press for this, and then went home, bought oil pipelines that even industry said, these aren't viable. There's too much opposition. The Trudeau government went in and spent billions of taxpayer dollars buying oil pipelines instead of pulling money from subsidies, and there are still billions of dollars in subsidies in Canada going to fossil fuel industries. Instead of moving that money to the next economy, and really harnessing the power of the public, the power of the commons for this urgent transformation. What makes me hopeful is not the leaders, because I think we're going to hear those speeches and we're really still not going to have a binding agreement, and we have to go in knowing that. I feel hopeful that the movement is back, that people are back in the streets. And I think so far we've seen that is really the only force that can shake some real changes in policy.
So Naomi, you said that because of the kind of it's almost like a fake discourse that people come there, they've now improved, they know how to at least get global approval for what they say, but that's not like backed with action. but still going from, when you first started writing the shock doctrine or this changes everything, to the fact that now, whether it's the Vatican or big corporates or, any of these global leaders, even China, I was hoping to interview Jane Goodall later in the month, and she actually says she's feeling quite hopeful even about China, so just the fact that people have to speak this language, do you think that that's a big change from where we were?
So I think that even non-binding agreements can be useful as long as movements use them. So for instance, we knew when they negotiated the Paris Accord that it was non-binding, but the fact that they put in the 1.5 to 2 degree temperature target, even though they never had policies in line with meeting those targets, is a tool in the hands of mobilized populations to hold governments accountable, to change governments. So it's not that words don't matter, but they certainly don't matter in and of themselves. And I think they can be very dangerous if they create the impression that everything is in hand and you can all relax because the leaders are handling this, because they're absolutely not. But there has been a huge shift. There has been a huge shift since, I published This Changes Everything in 2014, which was an argument against looking at the climate crisis as a sort of a technocratic issue that could be solved with a little bit of carbon pricing, a few market incentives, and in fact was arguing that approach, which often made energy more expensive for people, was leading to a backlash, because whenever you'd have an economic crisis, you had this pattern where there'd be all of this energy. Yes, we're all going to come together and save the world. Then there'd be an economic crisis and be like, goodbye environment. We're working on jobs, bread and butter. And this was particularly dramatic after the 2008 financial crisis, because this was the period of inconvenient truth, and Al Gore wins the Nobel Prize, and then it was just like, nope, we're not talking about environment anymore. And so what gives me hope is that, when I published This Changes Everything and said, no, this is about capitalism, this is about our whole economy, we need policies that don't ask people to choose between caring about the natural world, our only home, and their need to take care of their family and make sure that their kids are fed and that they are not living on the edge. And so that's the concept of climate justice, not just climate action. So that means that as we respond to the climate crisis, we have an urgent need to address other crises that we face, to redress the massive inequality crises between our countries, within our countries, where I live, dating back to the very founding of this colonial project called Canada, which is based on Indigenous land theft and subsidized by the theft of African people. So we have a lot of things wrong, not just climate. And if we're going to listen to the scientists who say, hey, you need fundamental transformation, why wouldn't we seize this opportunity to create policies that actually will motivate many more people to get involved in this, because it addresses their need for food, for homes, for jobs, and doesn't ask them to make those choices between caring about economics and caring about the planet.
So, Naomi, I'm going to pull you deeper into this conversation, both these arguments, about your criticism of capitalism, the entire system, you combining the need for justice with climate, with mitigating climate change, and also the shape of the new Green Deal. But before that, for a lot of our audience who are not even yet engaged at emotional or imaginative or, even at a surface level with this conversation, I just wanted you to articulate, a little bit about why, when all of this is happening, why are you feeling this despairing? So sitting in Canada, for instance, what is it that you're seeing around you? So drive home for my audience that what is the urgency of this?
So I'm speaking to you from British Columbia, Canada, and on the West Coast. And, this has really become the front line of the climate crisis, one of the front lines of the climate crisis in North America. And of course, in India, you've been on the front lines for a long time. But, here's just a little snapshot of what we've been living with. Obviously, COVID, and it's not under control here. But in June, we experienced something called the heat dome, which is something we've never experienced before. I should say, where I am, it's technically a temperate rainforest. This is not, it never gets hot. The summer is like 25 degrees. We reached 46 degrees in June, which isn't even our hottest month. And so nothing here is adapted to that type of heat, and including humans, but all of biodiversity here isn't adapted to that. Our trees aren't adapted to it. Our fish aren't adapted to it. So an entire community burned to the ground just north of here called Lytton. Most impacted were Indigenous people, First Nations, and more than 1 billion sea creatures died. There was this incredible stench because what happened is we had this heat dome happened at very low and high tides. So at the low tides, all of the marine creatures just cooked. They just cooked on the beaches. So we were overwhelmed with this sort of stench of death. People died. More than 600 people died during the heat dome, mostly elderly people living alone, as is so often the case. So you see these intersections of different kinds of vulnerabilities, right? A failure of social care, as well as of ecological collapse. And then the wildfires just raged in the interior of this province, just choking us with smoke and turning our skies orange. And in the midst of all this, we have an election and we're barely talking about it. So it's this moment of strange dissonance. And we are still waiting for our leaders to act as if the house is on fire, as Greta Thunberg has said, and so many others. The people know that it is, but the problem is that the more they see their leaders just turning away, the more that anger turns into despair and a feeling like nothing is ever going to change. And then you get into a negative cycle where people think, look, nobody's going to care for us. We just have to take care of our own. It's just, our fate is in our own hands. And then that can lead to decisions of more consumption, right? Like, I need to protect my family. I need more land. I need, and so then you further feed the ecological crisis. So I think that's, we saw a lot of that in COVID here in North America as well, where rather than responding collectively and taking care of each other, the people who had the resources were like, I need a bigger house. I need a bigger yard. I need more space for my kids. And that just puts more and more pressure on the natural world.
When we were chatting earlier, you spoke about the entire salmon ecology in Canada, about just how all of the ecology around you is based on the salmon. And
that's the most devastating part of all this, is this part of the world. This is salmon country. And we are blessed to live with the most generous of all creatures that I know of, this hugely abundant species that feeds the orcas, the sea lions, the seals, the otters. Everybody loves salmon, the eagles, and the bears. And what's amazing about them is that they travel through these different ecosystems. So they spend part of their life in the ocean feeding all these marine mammals, and then they go upstream to where they were born, into fresh water, where they feed the bears, where they feed the eagles, where they feed the wolves, and then feed the trees, right? Their nutrients feed our amazing cedars and Douglas firs. And, when the salmon collapses, everything collapses. And so what was so devastating about this year was our riverbeds went dry and the baby salmon were in these hot little puddles and they just couldn't survive. So the effect of this heat dome is not actually known. We know what happened this year, but the really terrifying thing is what happened when those baby salmon in those hot and dry streams don't grow into adults because they died in their infancy. And so then what happens to this whole ecosystem that is based on this one amazing keystone species?
So, as I said, I'm going to take you deeper into, your earlier arguments of your book. But upfront, apart from the fact that you feel that there's quite a bit of hypocrisy still around these conversations, for something to shift, like it's like really turning a giant ship around, So whereas a lot of people today feel hope that at least people are talking the talk, is because it takes time to turn a ship around. So, a lot of our, when you're talking about wars for social justice, whether it's for adult suffrage or women's suffrage or the abolition movement on slaves, or, all of that took a long time to happen.
Yeah.
So for someone like you who's been engaged so long in this, why would you not give the same amount of time for the climate conversation and the ship to turn around?
Because it's different. Because we're on this deadline, this firm and unyielding deadline. It does take time, and we're out of time. That's the problem. And so even though there is this awakening, and what makes me hopeful is not just that there are millions marching in the street, and this is starting to happen again, because there have been other moments when there have been huge levels of focus on the environment. If we think about the Rio Earth Summit, for instance, or the original Earth Day, I think that what's different is that this generation of climate activists are not just climate activists. They are they're also the ones marching for Black lives. They are also engaged in struggles for Indigenous land rights. They want to connect the dots. This generation has grown up amidst overlapping and intersecting crisis. I mean, this is the COVID generation. This is the climate generation. This is the generation that, they understand that their phones are surveilling them. They understand that the whole information ecosystem has failed. They feel betrayed by their political class. And so whereas I when I started getting involved in this issue, I would come up against so many environmentalists who, I always quote Arundhati Roy, who says, middle-class environmentalists ask the question, how do we change without changing? Because that was the ethos. How do we change? How do we protect the status quo as much as possible while still, seeming like we're doing something about climate? So I think the big shift is that this generation is not asking, how do we change without changing? They hunger for deep change because they understand that the ecological crisis is not the only crisis they face, that they have a massive crisis of income inequality. They have a massive crisis of our information ecology. They want something different. And that makes so much possible if we're not just trying to protect the status quo, because it's really impossible to respond to the depths of the climate crisis in line with what scientists are telling us, while not confronting the broader economic and political failure that produced that crisis.
So, so then let me actually bring attention to your new book, which is about, how to change everything. And your focus is on the youth movement. And you've just spent some time talking about that big shift, which is that they see the intersections and they're willing for radical change. And they are clearly pressurizing, at least for the rhetoric to change, so they are having that impact. But you didn't entirely address the question I first asked, Naomi, which is that, for the audiences that are not yet fully tuned into this, that so if all these things are happening, political leaders are starting to at least talk the talk. We have pressure coming from the future generations, the young, which is a very, very important constituency because everyone is parents, so if you have kids sort of demanding action from you, you're more bound to respond. So these are hopeful signs. So then why anxiety from someone like you? What's with the clock?
Because there's so much political dysfunction. And we still have a political class that's kind of running out the clock and trying to do two things at once. Okay, we'll do a few things on climate, but we're going to keep subsidizing fossil fuels. We're going to keep buying pipelines. We're going to keep giving new permits, and and that just doesn't work. So it is an anxious moment, and it's also a moment where we have to be honest that we have not done what we needed to do to prevent really, really dangerous levels of warming. We're in it. And we've locked in a certain amount of warming. in the next decade, even if we do everything right. And that makes it all the more urgent, I think, to have these truly intersectional responses that I think of them as shock absorbers. You mentioned the shock doctrine, and I think a lot about what happens to societies in moments of shock and moments of stress. And you really see two very strong trends in those stress moments, in those shock moments. And even thinking about COVID, we have a very fresh example of that. Crises, shocks, they bring out the best in us. We rise to the occasion. We engage in incredible mutual aid. We want to help our neighbors. We find our best selves. That's something that happens during crisis. But there's another part of it. We can also turn on each other. We can panic. We can regress. We can put our faith in strongman leaders, and we can just feel like we just have to look after our own. And so I think the fork in the roads is like, who are we going to be in this crisis? And if we want to act on those better parts of ourselves, understanding that humans are complex, we are all of these mess of contradictions that are capable of incredible solidarity and incapable of incredible brutality and barbarism. If we want to be that better version of us, we have to invest in these shock absorbers that fight the feeling of scarcity. So we need governments that do what governments like the government of Kerala has done during COVID, of saying, look, we're going to take care of the basics. We're going to make sure everyone has food. So you don't have to panic about that, right? And so, what you see that when governments do that, when societies do that, like we're going to make sure everyone has a home. We're going to make sure everybody has medicine. We're going to make sure that everybody has food. That acts as a social shock absorber when we face these difficult times.
So, Naomi, we're kind of jumping some of the conversations because I actually wanted to lay out your core argument for audiences who are not familiar. But because you brought this up, there's some criticism of your books or of your positions by people who say, yes, you're a very important message carrier. And it's very important to just be a resistor sometimes, because just with the sheer force of your passion and your resistance, you've helped create conversations which wouldn't have been created by more moderate, accommodative conversations. But having created your message, the criticism of you is that, you're not that much into policy, you're not explaining how things can be done. These are very, very complex phenomena. And when we want to build houses for all, access to equity for all, then we need a lot of money, and so your criticism of capitalism, the pushback is none of the socialist regimes did well, none of the communist regimes did well, governments don't necessarily do well, and how will we generate the money for all, So what would be your response to that?
Well, I guess all I can say is I'm old enough to remember moments when our governments have been able to create a whole bunch of money to bail out powerful interests, whether it was the 2008 financial crisis and the mobilization of many trillions of dollars, or even the COVID bailouts more recently of industry. And so I think or the size of the military budgets in the US and to a lesser extent in Canada. So I just don't accept these arguments around scarcity. I know that when a society decides that something is important, that it is too important to fail, the resources are available. And we must insist that failure is not an option when life itself is on the line. And I don't accept the criticism that I'm only critiquing, because what I've been focused on really quite systematically for more than a decade is laying out the framework of what is sometimes called a Green New Deal, or others have called it a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. But what it is a transition to the next economy that does not leave it to the market, that says this is much too important. The future of our very species, the future of our one and only home is much too important to leave to the market, which produced this, which isn't to say that there's no role for the free market in this, but it is simply to say that the market will not lead. And if we think about the Second World War, as an example of a society mobilizing, it wasn't left to businesses to decide whether or not they were going to transition for the war effort. It wasn't left to individuals to decide whether they were going to hoard resources that were needed. It was planned, it was organized, it was directed. And so a Green New Deal response is now, it's not a notional concept. We now have pieces of legislation that have been put forward. And I've been happy to be able to work and advise on some of these, where we have this group that we call the Squad in the United States, in the US Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, more recently Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, all of whom represent some of the poorest districts in the United States, that are overwhelmingly African-American and immigrant populations who have gotten the very worst deal in our current system, the most decrepit schools, the most violent policing. And these are visions for how we solve multiple problems at once. So there's the Green New Deal for housing, the Green New Deal for public housing, which is a vision for how we transform affordable public housing and social housing into green, beautiful public housing that people want to live in, that are not just warehousing people. We now have a Green New Deal for schools, which is beginning with those most neglected communities, a Green New Deal for cities, which is saying, like, this is not, we need the resources of the federal government, but we want this to be directed at the community level. And that was introduced by Cori Bush. So we have plans. It's not that we don't have plans. This is sort of, honestly, a little bit of an old sneer on the left of, what you're against, but what are you for? We're telling you what we're for. We have plans. And frankly, it continues to be the influence of money and politics that is standing in the way. The reason why Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, which includes some of these elements in it because of huge, movement pressure, the reason that has not been able to get through the Senate is because of a guy named Joe Manchin, who's the biggest stumbling block, and he has, he's actively invested in the coal industry in the United States, and his kids are invested in the coal industry in the United States. So it's not a complicated reason why this isn't happening. Yeah.
And to actually bolster the argument you're making, just minutes before we started our conversation, I was just reading the news, and the IMF has come up with a report which says that the fossil fuel industry is subsidized to the tune of $11 million per minute, so when we're talking about a scarce. And the other interesting statistic is that during the pandemic, the top billionaires of the world, I think their wealth increased, not their total wealth, but their wealth increased by $540 billion, and some of the, I think,
it's obscene.
Argument that just the increase in their wealth in this last year and a half would be enough to vaccinate the entire world, that actually strengthens the argument you're making that there is enough money. But just to push it.
We live in a time of unprecedented private wealth, and we have all watched the billionaires blast into space in this period. That is how, they just have much more money than they know what to do with. And they're now in this ridiculous competition. And even that is, massively publicly subsidized as well, their space missions. And so all of this, I just think, speaks to a failure of leadership, a huge failure of leadership. And I think it's just a red herring to say, socialism has never worked. This is not working. And life on the planet is on the line. We need to try something else.
So I'm just going to push a little bit more on this,
sure.
And play the devil's advocate here, because unfortunately or fortunately, I agree with your worldview. So, but I just want those who are naysayers to have their doubts addressed, So, which is that, to a certain extent, the pushback on this argument is, of course, there's enough wealth, and I think people would be hard put to argue that, if there was a policy change, for instance, in India, in all fairness, there is quite a bit of emphasis on solar and wind and clean energies, there's focus on that. But the transition, I want your views on that, and I'll come to it. But there's also an argument that for such gigantic change, for innovation, to just put all these structures on ground, that you actually need large structures of money, whether it's government or capital corporates that are repurposed, but you do need large structures. That is not just enough to talk about villages or little communities taking care of each other. There are larger structures that also need to be turned around, and that needs large amounts of money and purpose and research and all of that. So there, what would you say? Should we be collaborating with corporates or necessarily dismantling the whole capitalist project?
Well, I would just say, for starters, that the fossil fuel industry has been, we've talked a lot about politicians, but the truth is that the fossil fuel industry is the single largest reason why we have failed to act. They have waged a systematic misinformation campaign to spread doubt about the reality of climate change, to just muddy the waters, and of course have flooded our various political systems with money in a couple of forms. One is the sort of direct donations to politicians, but the other is the threat of attack and the ability to run advertisements attacking the politicians who go against them, which is, so you've got the carrot and you also have the stick. And so, no, I don't think that we need to appease them or find some technology that's going to allow them to continue doing what they're doing, but bury the carbon underground or whatever, whatever their model is. I think, yeah.
Sorry, just to correct emphasize my question, not at all saying that find ways to perpetuate the fossil industry. I was talking about the whole transition to a green economy. Does that need also large deployment of money and expertise and technical expertise, research, etc.?
Well, of course it does. Of course it does. And I think it's a false dichotomy around whether or not we put money into research or deployment. I think we do both at the same time. And I think the record shows that you learn most when you deploy at speed. And, everything I've been talking about is about mobilizing public financing to do this very rapidly. But in terms of how, the role of large players is interesting, because I think there are some things where you do need very much you need a centralized plan if you want to meet targets, right? So you can't just say, have a free for all, everybody just put up solar panels and we'll hope for the best. You need to have targets, and you need to have systems of keeping yourself accountable. You have a carbon budget, you have to stay in that carbon budget. But there are ways of designing policies that encourage decentralization as opposed to having what we've had now, which is, energy duopolies or just a few large players in each country. One of the wonderful things to me about renewables as a model is that they offer us this opportunity to have a more decentralized economy. Right now, we have a great deal of corporate concentration. It's true in your country and mine, where you have a few just mega players, and they exercise outsized influence in every aspect of society. Whether it's foundations, media, education, everywhere. And that in part is because the industry that an industry based on extracting resources from the earth lends itself to centralization. It costs a lot of money to dig up coal or oil or gas. It costs a lot of money to process it. It costs a lot of money to transport it. The beautiful thing about wind and solar is that they are by their very nature decentralized, right? They are everywhere. And so, yes, you could organize it in a way where you had a few big players in wind and solar, but why would you? You have an opportunity now to have a much more democratic and decentralized economy with many more small players and a diversity of players, right? So some of them will be privately owned, but many of them can be energy cooperatives. Many of them can be municipally owned, where the benefits, the profits of energy generation stays in the communities. You can use it for services like childcare. You can keep those benefits locally. And considering that as coming back to what I was saying earlier, that climate isn't the only crisis we face. We also face a crisis of care. We also face, an inability to pay for schools and so many other things. Why would we want to replicate this highly centralized system as we build the next economy? Why wouldn't we want to make it fairer and more decentralized?
So that's a whole very important part of the argument you make in your books, Naomi, which is that, it's not just sheer coincidence that the earth is on fire and the streets are on fire at the same time, and that social injustice and climate injustice are very interlinked. But I'll come to that. I'm just constantly thinking of how audiences will be receiving you, not the and so I want to mediate these things a little bit with more clarity. That I'm just thinking, typically, when one tries to put forward these arguments, the pushback is that, even now, for instance, you and I talking over Zoom or on the internet, or just all the large structures which have also pulled, for instance, since 1992, which is in India, when we opened up to globalization, there is huge inequity that's happened. And yet also others will tell you that millions have been pulled out of poverty as well, and that there's larger middle class, that the socialist regime had brought us to a level where we were literally begging rice from America, and centralized planning didn't work. It's not human nature. Competition is essential for progress. So there are, arguments that people will make, and there's a breakdown of imagination, so you'll keep talking to those who believe in what you're saying, and there'll be others who. So how do you bridge that gap? What's this transition argument that we can make?
It's interesting. I mean, I think that there are limits to what we can do just by talking. And I think we are in, I think ecologically we're out of time. We have to be doing. And there's, I think a lot of that sort of partisan gap can be overcome by just starting to roll out what we mean at a local level. And this is, we use this example in the United States of the original New Deal, which happened in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression and an ecological crisis, as well as an economic crisis, because there was the Dust Bowl and there was a huge farming crisis in the 1930s. And there was the same partisan divide, this is socialism, it's fascism, you can't have government involved creating millions and millions of jobs and direct programs. They were electrifying rural areas, they were building schools, they were planting trees. I mean, it was a huge project, and it was designed to get the country out of depression. And it ultimately didn't even get out of depression until the Second World War, but ameliorated millions of people's lives. Because you know what? There are different ways of doing that. And one of the things that I find interesting in studying that history, and I've spent a fair bit of time doing that, because I think we need examples of times when we have come together and done big things. FDR, who was president at the time, he was facing this opposition and this partisan divide. And what he did is he systematically cited New Deal projects in the communities that voted against him and were most opposed to him. And people experienced the benefits for themselves. They experienced the jobs, they experienced the improved infrastructure. And in a lot of cases, they voted for FDR when he ran again and was reelected with a landslide, which I think shows that at a certain point, you stop talking about it and you start doing it, and people experiencing it, and then people screaming about Venezuela are a little less relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very convincing argument, because see, even in India, we are seeing lots of local transformation, of barren places, desertification that's being turned around just by local water structures, local changes in attitude, collaboration, like you said. And there people become economically self-sufficient. And then you realize that really this massive wealth gap that we're talking about, it's the people who are really feeling anxious about change are the ones really at the top of the pyramid, who,
and who are less able to talk to each other at the local level. I don't hold out a lot of hope of overcoming partisanship in Washington, D.C., but I've seen it happen, in local communities when people come together after a disaster and decide to rebuild their community as a green transition project, and you can bring Republicans together with Democrats. And, if you're talking about your own backyard, if you're talking about where you're going to get your energy, and wouldn't it be good to be more independent and less, and you don't have to have an argument about climate change at all. You can just talk about the benefits of having solar as opposed to coal, And yeah, I've seen some real progress there.
So I was asking you that question about transition. In India right now, we have this situation where the petrol prices and diesel prices are going really high. There's a sense that the government is using that tax to fund the welfare that they're doing, but at the same time, it's really, really tough on people to pay that kind of money. And yet we haven't yet transited to a completely green economy. There isn't enough solar, wind. It's not even affordable, So what do you do in this interim, Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, this is the danger of, these sort of neoliberal responses to the climate crisis, and they can generate backlash to the whole idea of climate action. We saw this in France with Macron when he introduced a petrol tax to pay for his climate policies, but at the same time, he was giving tax breaks to the very wealthy, and so it was working people, it was truck drivers, it was people who drive for a living, who need to commute to get to their jobs, who live in rural areas that don't have public transit, who were hit the hardest, and basically were being asked to subsidize all of these fancy words from their president, and they backlashed, and they started, the Yellow Vest movement, the Gilets jaunes movement, and there were riots in the street, and so that's why we make the argument that if instead of calling for climate action, you're calling for climate justice, which means that the most vulnerable are actually going to get a better deal. They're the ones who are going to be subsidized instead of the fossil fuel companies. And you transition in a way that protects the jobs of the coal workers, of the oil workers, protects their salary levels, protects their benefit levels, and has a polluter pays framework. And the polluters are the corporations, but they're also the wealthier countries like mine that have been emitting since the industrial age, since the dawn of industrialization, and owe a climate debt. And how that works, as you know, is enormously complex, and our leaders will be fighting about it in Glasgow to no end. But there is agreement that there is common but differentiated responsibilities here. And so, yeah, I think it's really very dangerous when you have politicians who are unwilling to take on capital, unwilling to take on polluters, and introduce climate policies that shift the burden, the economic burden, onto already overburdened working people. It's a recipe for backlash and backsliding, and we just can't afford it.
So then that brings me to that, that piece that I was putting on the side for the moment, which was this connection between social justice. So you've explained the economic justice, of not making first the poor are the most vulnerable to climate change, the erosion of seas, climate migration, capacity to withstand heat, all of that. So that's and then if you're also going to make them pay for the transition to the green economy, it's not going to work. So you've explained that well, but you also attach the idea of social justice, race, culture, gender, etc., to justice. Can you help explain that for the audience?
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about it is that what we need in this moment is an ethos of repair, that we need to repair our relationships with the planet. We need to repair the damage that we've done. We need to clean up these areas of huge devastation. And we need to repair our relationships with each other, including making reparation for harms that in many cases date back hundreds of years. So once again, bringing it back concretely to where I am, my country is a country that is founded on Indigenous land theft. British Columbia, where I live, is the vast majority of British Columbia is entirely unceded by First Nations. There's no treaty. There's never a war. And our courts have affirmed that Indigenous people have rights to these lands, to huge parts of the province. And in fact, they're much better stewards of these lands. And this has come up again and again around the fires, because Indigenous people had a land care ethic that included fire and using controlled burning to prevent buildup of fuel in the forests, which is why we've had these huge fires, because that was banned for many, many years. And so bringing social justice and climate action together, one thing it would mean where I live is bringing together the calls for indigenous land back and land control together with the need for climate action. So, so returning huge parts of the land back to indigenous jurisdiction and control. These are some communities that lack running water in many cases, lack most basic social services. In the climate justice movement, we sometimes refer to this as the front lines first. There has to be the frontline communities, the communities that are most exploited, their lands, the sites of the most polluting extraction, their communities, sites for the dirtiest industries and waste disposal. Those communities need to be first in line to have the support for their green energy projects, for their ecological agriculture projects. And that's how we do two things at once. That's how we lower emissions, but repair these great wrongs that tear our worlds apart.
So, Naomi, again, I'm funneling all the counter.
Yeah, I know, but you know what? We're actually out of time, so you don't get any more counter arguments.
Then let me just ask you one last question. I mean, I was going to tell you that the argument people make on returning land to indigenous people is that even before the colonial powers came, that there was a lot of coexistence with nature, but we're going to get dragged into a very long conversation. Not towards that, but just the last question, Naomi, which is that you've written a book now which is about the youth movement across the world, and so let's end on a note of individual inspiration, if not framework inspiration yet, that in this entire time, whether it's corporates, whether it's governments or young people, is there anyone that's giving you hope? Can you name out a few people?
So many people. I think the youth climate movement is leaderful. It has so many leaders. And I love watching these young people, and let's be honest, most of them are young women, the way they support each other around the world. And Disha Ravi in India is somebody who I have great inspiration for, great respect for. And when she was under such, I think, incredibly unfair attack, it was wonderful to watch how other climate leaders or young women around the world, I would mention obviously Greta, but Shia Batista in the US, Autumn Peltier here in Canada, an young indigenous water protector, the way they really see each other as sisters, and I think one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that they really are showing a level of internationalism that I feel like a lot of progressive movements have lost. The internationalism that used to really be at the heart of progressive politics has dwindled in recent years, and this generation of young climate leaders has rekindled it in building and weaving this web of children and young adults around the world.
Yeah. And just on corporates, because there's some, like whether it's Bill Gates or it's other corporates who are committing to at least turning around and becoming green within their structures. What do you think about that?
So I think that it's a distraction, and I think they need to be taxed, and I think they need to be regulated. And I have written about this extensively over the years. It's not new. I have a chapter in This Changes Everything about how the billionaires are not going to save us, and it looks at the grand pledges of 2008, 2009, when Richard Branson promised to spend all of the profits from his transportation companies to solve the climate crisis, and created funds and awards just as Jeff Bezos is today. And because it was all voluntary, he just didn't do it in the end. He spent some money, but nothing near what he pledged. And this is the problem with a kind of a voluntary-based approach. We can't gamble our planet on it.
Thank you very much, Naomi.
Thank you.
And as our governments are at least talking the talk, I think it's really important to have voices like yours reminding that the action needs to catch up, and we have 1 decade, going by the IPCC report, and that's the true urgency. So thank you for voices like yours, and it's a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Take care.